Bonjour, my name is Katie and I will be teaching this French for Beginners class. I have a pretty good understanding of French because I've been studying it for 6 years and I'm planning to continue studying it in college. I love French and I know a lot of people want to speak it but don't know where to begin, so I'm teaching this class to help people gain basic French speaking skills and learn more about French culture. You don't need any prior knowledge of French for this class. It is just for anyone interested or planning to travel to France anytime soon. This class has some main goals and I'd like to share them with you before you begin this class. So some of the things we'll be doing are learning about common French traditions and cultural aspects. You'll be able to understand important phrases from native French speakers. You'll learn some basic vocabulary about daily topics such as food, transportation, shopping, and a lot of the other most important things when traveling to France. And you'll also learn about other conversational basics like greetings, agreeing and disagreeing with people, sharing feelings, and some basic counting skills as well. There will be about 7 modules in this class and each of them will be around 10 to 20 minutes, and I'll also assign some optional quizzes and worksheets for those of you who want to practice more and get an even better understanding. So once again, I just wanted to reiterate, this is a very beginner level course. So I'm really excited to see how this goes and I'm really excited to be teaching this class. À bientôt! Bonjour! In today's lesson, we will be learning about basic greetings and introductions. So first, we'll be going through a very basic introduction and how you would say hello to someone and introduce yourself, and then say goodbye to them. So the first thing you would say when you say someone is, I'm sure you can guess it, bonjour. And this directly translates to good day, and you say it as hello. Next, you would say je m'appelle and then your name. So je m'appelle means my name is, and then the next thing that you would do is ask them what their name is. And to do that, you would say comment vous appelez-vous? And this means what is your name? And comment vous appelez-vous is the formal version of saying that, and comment tu t'appelles is the informal way of saying that. So when you're introducing yourself to someone and asking for their name, make sure that you try to use the correct one. So if it's someone about your age, maybe a new friend, it would probably be appropriate to use comment tu t'appelles. But if it's an adult or someone for a job interview, you should definitely say comment vous appelez-vous? Next, they will say what their name is, and that's already a lot of information, so we're going to walk through that and see if you can remember what we've went through so far. So I'm gonna go through kind of a sample conversation and you reply with what you think you should say after I say something. So I'll begin. Bonjour. Je m'appelle Katie. Comment vous appelez-vous? Did you get everything right? I hope so, but it's okay if you didn't. So now we're going to move on to what you would say after all of that, which is, for most people, nice to meet you. You say that by saying enchanté, and they would most likely say that back to you. And finally, if you're headed out and done with that conversation with them, you just say au revoir, and that means goodbye. So now we've learned how to go through a basic introduction with someone, and hopefully we can remember all of those things because we're about to go into a lot more detail about other ways to greet people and ask how they are. So I'm going to review one more time the things we've already learned. So bonjour is hello. Je m'appelle is my name is. Comment vous appelez-vous is what is your name formally. And comment tu t'appelles is the informal way of asking someone what their name was. Enchanté was nice to meet you. And then au revoir is goodbye. So next, we're going to go into other ways of saying hello and goodbye. So first is salut, which is pretty informal and it can mean both hi and bye. If you're going to France, you'll probably hear a lot of native speakers saying that to each other because it's one of the most common ones. And another informal way of saying bye is ciao. Next, we're going to learn about bonsoir, which means good evening. So if you want to always be grammatically correct, use bonsoir once it is after 3 p.m. and don't say bonjour after that time. So you're not going to get in trouble or anything if you get those mixed up, but for the most part, bonsoir is only said after afternoon. So next is à bientôt, which means see you soon. Then there's à demain, which is see you tomorrow. And then à plus tard means see you later, and bonne nuit means good night. So we're going to go over all of those again because that was a lot of information and it's important to go through these multiple times to help you understand and get a good grip for them. So I'm going to say each of them and then I hope that you'll repeat every one of these phrases after I say them. Salut, ciao, bonsoir, à bientôt, à demain, à plus tard, bonne nuit. Okay, I hope that you got all of those or at least started to understand them. I know that this can be a lot at first. So next we're going to go into asking someone how they are and different ways that you can respond and then ask how they're doing as well. So first, you could ask someone formally how they're doing by saying, comment allez-vous? And this means, how are you? But if you're asking someone you know better or it's a little more of an informal setting, you would say ça va or comment ça va, which means how are you doing or how is it going? So now we're going to go through a few different ways to reply when someone asks you this. So first you could just say ça va, which means I'm okay. Next you could say ça va bien, merci, which means I'm well, thank you. Next, you could say ça va mal, which means I'm not doing well. You could also say ça va comme ci comme ça, which means, oh, I'm so-so. You can also do these responses by saying je vais, which is like I'm going, and you could say je vais bien, and that would also mean I'm fine or I'm well. And you could say je vais mal, which means I'm doing poorly. And another common response to ça va is tout va bien, which means everything's going well. So I'm going to go through those one more time. So the first reply was ça va, which was I'm okay. Ça va bien, merci is I'm well, thank you. Ça va mal is I'm not doing well. Ça va comme ci comme ça is I'm so-so. Je vais bien is I'm fine. Je vais mal is I'm doing poorly. And tout va bien is everything's going well. And when you're having a conversation with someone, a lot of people tend to reply to how are you with asking how that person is doing. So in French, you would say this by replying et vous, which means and you, but this is the formal way of saying it because we'll learn in some later lessons that vous is the more formal way of saying you, and tu is the informal version, so you would say tu or toi. So you would say et toi if you're asking someone you're more familiar with how they're doing. So I know that was a lot, so I'm gonna try to review everything that we've gone through in this lesson somewhat quickly and try to repeat the things I say, and you can go back and watch this again if you want to review. So first was bonjour, which meant hello, and then je m'appelle was my name is. Then we learned comment vous appelez-vous or comment tu t'appelles, which is asking someone what their name is. And then we said enchanté, which is nice to meet you, and au revoir, goodbye. Then we learned the informal and other ways of greeting someone. So we went through salut, ciao, bonsoir, and then we learned à bientôt, which was see you soon, à demain, which was see you tomorrow, and à plus tard, which is see you later. And then we learned how to say good night, which was bonne nuit. And next we went on to asking how you're doing and how to reply to that and ask someone else how they're doing. And once again, someone asks how you're doing by saying comment allez-vous or ça va. And the most common ways we can reply to this are by saying ça va bien, ça va mal, je vais bien, je vais mal, or tu vas bien, comme ci, comme ça. And we would ask someone else how they're doing by saying et vous or et toi. I hope that this lesson was useful for all of you, and I'm looking forward to the next lesson. À bientôt! Bonjour! In today's lesson, we will be learning all about French accents. There are 5 main accents, and for each of them, I'll tell you what they do, what letters they go on, what they look like, and I'll give you some example words. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first accent is the cédille, and that is in French la cédille, and it only goes on C's, and it looks like a little squiggle underneath it. It's like a little, it's hard to explain, but it's just a little squiggle, and it's pronounced like an S. So whenever you see a C with an accent cédille, you pronounce it as you would if there were an S there. The accent cédille only is ever seen before A, O, or U, and that is because it can only go before these vowels because it changes the pronunciation to an S to change the sound with the vowel. So 2 pretty common examples are français, which means French. So you have the accent on your C there, and that's why you say français and not franquais. And the other main example of this is garçon, which means boy. And if you didn't have the accent, it would be garçon. And that's obviously very different. So the next accent we'll learn about is the acute accent, which in French is known as l'accent aigu, and it looks kind of like a slanted line, almost like a ramp. It's like that, and it is only ever found above the letter E, and it changes the pronunciation of the vowel. It's pronounced like A, but not quite as long as that. It's more like A. It's hard to explain until you hear it in some words, so I'll give you 2 different examples. So the first one is marché, and so that means market, and as you can see, it's not marché, it's marché. So it's kind of hard to tell the difference, but if you say marché, you'll just sound very obviously American. For the most part, with accent aigu, to be careful to not drag it out to an A, and to also make sure you note that it's not pronounced like just a normal E in French. and because it's about to get even more confusing with the next accents I introduce. So the next accent is the grave accent, which is known as l'accent grave in French. And it looks the same as accent aigu, but it's slanted the opposite way. And the way that I learned to remember accent grave is that this is kind of dark, but it looks like someone falling back into their grave. So like that. And so yeah, accent grave, falling back into the grave. So it's a little dark, but that's how I remember it. And accent grave is used with A, E, and U. And with A and U, it has a different function than with E. So with A, it distinguishes some different words that are spelled the same but have different meanings. So it distinguishes ah from ah, which, you know, they sound the exact same, but when you have ah without an accent, it's a conjugated version of avoir, which means to have. And then when you have ah with the accent grave, it means at or to or in. So obviously those are two very different words, so it's very important to use accent grave to distinguish which word you're trying to use. Another common use for accent grave is la versus la, which once again they're pronounced the exact same but mean different things. So the version without the accent is the feminine article, and so it means the, but that's the feminine version. The masculine version is le. And then when you have la with accent grave on the A, it means here. So once again, two very different meanings, and the accent is very important to distinguish them. For U, a common example is u versus u, and u without the accent on the U means or, and u with the accent over the U means where. So once again, very important to distinguish between the two. And then when you have, also it doesn't change the pronunciation. Like I said, it just can change the meaning of the word if you have the accent. So try not to get that confused with accent aigu also, since they look so much alike. It can be easy to accidentally put an accent aigu where you should have an accent grave, but once again, aigu only is ever found above an E. So if you find yourself with an accent aigu over an A or a U, you know that you have switched up your accents by accident. So also, when you use accent grave with E, it changes the pronunciation. So it doesn't with A or U, but with E, it changes the pronunciation to E. So one example is PS, which is a play, or lèvre, which means lip. So accent grave is a little more complicated because of the different rules it has with the U and A versus E, so make sure to really practice this one if you don't want to get it confused a lot. The next accent is the circumflex. In French, it's known as l'accent circonflexe, and it looks like a pointy hat, so it's like that over the letter, and it's found above all 5 vowels, and it changes the pronunciation for A, E, and O. When you have an accent circonflexe above an A, it makes it into an ah sound. So one example is pâté, which means paste. When you have an accent circonflexe above E, it changes the pronunciation to e, which is the same as when you have it above, or when you have accent grave above an E. And so one example of this is forêt, which means forest. Then when you have accent circonflexe above an O, it changes the pronunciation to O. And one example of this is l'hôtel, which means the hotel. And then with I and U, it doesn't change the pronunciation. It's just kind of there on some words. And then the final accent is the trema, which is known as l'accent tréma in French. And it looks like just two little dots that sit right above the letter. Accent tréma goes above E, I, or U, and it's always written over the second of two vowels, so you've probably seen it before with the name Zoe or Chloe, where it goes on the E, and what it does is it distinguishes that there are two separate vowel sounds there, so you would say Zoe, not Zo, and yeah, so it shows that the two vowels are pronounced separately. And another common example is Noël, which in French means Christmas. So that was all 5 of the accents. I'll give you a quick overview of them again, just so that you can try to remember them a little better. So first we had the cedilla, which is only on C, but it makes it sound like an S when you have it there. And then we had accent aigu, which was the ramp looking one that is only goes above an E and changes it to an A sound. And then we had accent grave, which looks like someone falling back into their grave, and it's used with A, E, and U. And for A and U, it changed the meaning of the word, and then with E it changes the pronunciation to E. So next we had l'accent circonflexe, which was our little pointy hat that goes above all of the vowels, and we talked about how it changes the pronunciation of A, E, and O to A, E, and O. And then with I and U, it does not change the pronunciation. And then the final accent we covered was l'accent tréma, and that one was the two little dots that go above an E, I, or U, and they distinguish that there are two separate vowel sounds there. So again, we talked about Zoe and Chloe and how the accent gives us the two different sounds there. So I hope that you continue to review these different accents, because they'll be very important in learning to pronounce all kinds of words in French, and they'll really help you get a better understanding for both reading and speaking French. And that's all for today. I'm looking forward to the next course. À bientôt. Bonjour. In today's lesson, we'll be learning about conjugation basics. So there are 3 main types of verbs in French. They have 3 different endings, which are ER, IR, and RE. And today we're also going to learn the conjugations of the 3 most common and important irregular verbs, which are être, avoir, and aller. And we're going to learn about être and avoir in one of our next few lessons, so we'll get a little bit of a head start on that. So I'll also only be teaching these conjugations in present tense. There are so many different tenses to learn in the future if you continue to learn French, but I'm only going to cover present tense because things will get way too complicated if I try to teach all of the other tenses of these verbs. So for each verb, there are 6 different forms. So you have a form for je, which is I, tu, which is you, il, elle, which is he or she, and then nous is we, vous is you, the formal version, and then il, elle, with those have an S on the end, and that's the plural version, so it means they. So you have a different form for each of those for the verbs, so it's important to first know what your subject is when you're working on conjugating a verb. So the first type we're going to talk about is ER, and this is the most basic and common verb form to memorize, and it's also probably the easiest one to memorize. So for each form, you're going to drop the ER on the end of the word, and then for the je form, your ending will be an E, and then for to, your ending is ES. For il, your ending is E, and then for new, your ending is ONS, and make sure to notice that there's not an E before the ONS. A lot of people make that mistake. And then for VU, you have EZ as your ending, and then for il, plural, you have ENT as your ending. So a common example to use for an ER verb is parler, which means to talk. And I'm going to go through this conjugation, and I'll make sure to put out how you spell these on the bottom so that it's a little more clear, because a lot of them sound the exact same, but they're spelled differently. So first, for I, you'll have je parle, so I speak, and you'll have tu parle, which has an S on the end, and that's you speak. And then you have il parle with just one E, no S, which is he speaks, and then nous parlons, which is we speak, and remember it's not EONS, it's just ONS on the end. Then you have vous parlez, which is you formal speak, or it could be they speak. And then you have il parle, which it's important to realize you have the S on the end of il there, and then parle, even though it just sounds like P-A-R-L-E, that one is P-A-R-L-E-N-T, but you don't say parlant, you just say parle. Another example for an ER verb is aimer, which is to like, and so you would have j'aime, which is I like, and then tu aimes, you like, il aime, he likes, nous aimons, we like, vous aimez, you or they like, il aime, which is they like. So those are the ER endings. I'll go over them one more time because these ones are pretty important to memorize because they are your most basic level of conjugation. So your endings are E, ES, E, ONS, EZ, ENT. So really make sure to practice those ones because those will probably come up the most when you're trying to conjugate verbs. So now we're going to move on to the second form, which is IR verbs. And these are different for verbs that have like an OIR ending. These ones are only the regular ones for like a consonant and then IR. So for these endings, you're going to drop the IR, and then for your endings, you'll have IS, IS, IT, ISSONS, ISSEZ, and ISSENT. So the IS was for je, and it also is for tu, and then IT is for il or el, the singular version. Your ISSONS is for nous, which is we, and then your ISSEZ is for vous, and then the ISSENT is for your il plural, so your they. So one example for this would be finir, which means to finish. So you would have je finis, which is F-I-N-I-S, and then tu finis, spelled the exact same way, F-I-N-I-S, and then il fini, which is the exact same but with a T at the end instead of an S. And then nous finissons, so F-I-N-I-S-S-O-N-S, and then vous finissez, F-I-N-I-S-S-E-Z, and then il finisse. You don't say finissant, that is wrong, and you will sound very much not French if you say that. So make sure that you say il finisse, not finissant. So the ENT on the end of that is silent. So those are our IR endings. I'll go over them one more time before we move on. You have IS, IS, IT, ISSONS, ISSEZ, and then ISSENT. So next we have our RE endings, which are not too hard to memorize if you have the ER verbs down, because your endings for nous, vous, and il plural version are the exact same as er. So you have ons for new, ez for vous, and then ent for il. So it's really helpful if you have those ones down, because then you only have to know the versions for je, tu, and il, which are s, and then nothing. So again, make sure to drop your re on the end. So an example for this one would be vendre, which means to sell. So you would have je vends, which would be vends. So notice you dropped the r and the e, and then tu vends spelled the exact same as the first one, vends, and then il vend, just vend. There's no different ending for that, you just drop the re and there you have it. And then you have nous vendons, which would be the same as an er ending, and then vous vendez, and then il vend, and not vendons, vend. So those are your most basic verb conjugations, and those are only for regular verbs. There are a ton of irregular verbs in French that conjugate differently, and honestly there's not a ton of tricks for memorizing those. It just takes a ton of practice, so we won't go over a ton of these in this class just because it takes so much time. But if that's something you want to work on, I would recommend taking another French class after this one, because that will go more in depth in those. But I will teach 3 of the most important irregular ones that you'll come across the most. So the first 2 are être and avoir, which are your most common verbs in French. Être is to be and avoir is to have. And we'll cover those 2 verbs in one of our future lessons. And then the third one I'm going to teach you is aller, which means to go. For all of these, there aren't really easy tricks to remember them. It just takes a lot of practice and memorization, because you really do need to have these ones down if you, especially for writing, but it's also important in speaking. So the first one we'll go over is être, which is spelled etre, and you have an accent circumflex over that first e. So we already talked about the accents in our last lesson. So for être, it's pretty difficult to memorize. It doesn't really make much sense. So it's je suis, which is I am, tu es, which is just es, and then il est, est, nous sommes, sommes, vous êtes, which is your e with the circumflex, tes, and then ils sont, sont. So again, être, there isn't really a trick to memorizing this. It's very irregular, doesn't follow much of a pattern, so just practice, 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 and I'll go over those one more time before we move on to avoir. So je suis, tu es, il est, nous sommes, vous êtes, ils, elles sont. So next we'll go to avoir, which again means to have, and it's spelled avoir in the most basic version without any form of conjugation. So for avoir, you have j'ai, tu as, il a, nous avons, vous avez, and ils ont. So j'ai is J apostrophe AI, and that's I have. And make sure you notice that it's J apostrophe AI and not je space AI. And that's because you do that when you have J and then a vowel, and that shows your possession there. And then tu as is AS, il a is just A, nous avons is AVONS, vous avez is AVES, and then ils ont is ONT. And then finally we have aller, which again means to go, and you spell that ALLER, and your conjugations for that one are je vais, tu vas, il va, nous allons, vous allez, and ils vont. So je vais is VAIS, tu vas is VAS, il va is just VA, nous allons is ALLONS, vous allez is ALLEZ, and ils vont is VONT. So yeah, être, avoir, and aller are the main ones I would practice of the irregulars because once again, it just gets so complicated if you try to memorize all of them. I don't even know if it's possible to memorize all of them. I don't even know if all native French speakers have all of them memorized, but those are the three I would definitely focus on because they'll come up a lot in this class. And then once again, the most important tip for when you're conjugating these, especially with the versions I gave for the regulars, which were ER, IR, and RE, make sure that you drop those two letters before you do your conjugation, or else you'll get into all kinds of trouble and it will mess up all of your endings. So once again, the ER endings were E, ES, E, ONS, EZ, ENT, and those are the most important because for RE, the last three are the same. So if you have those down, you really just need to remember SS and then nothing with the RE dropped because the last three are the same. And then for IR, it's pretty different. So you have IS, IS, IT, ISSONS, ISSEZ, and then ISSENT. So that's all for today's lesson. I'm going to give you guys some worksheets to practice these with because it takes a lot of practice to get them down, but once you work through them enough, you'll have them memorized and it'll feel a lot easier. So I'm going to post those, and then that's all for today's lesson. À bientôt! Bonjour et bienvenue à leçon 4. In case we haven't learned some of those words yet, I just said hello and welcome to lesson 4. Today we're going to be learning about gender and numbers, so digging into singular and plural and really getting into those different articles that I'm sure you've heard a lot of, la, le, all those. So those can be really overwhelming because we don't have nearly that many articles in the English language, and so it can be a little overwhelming at first, but hopefully after going through these today, you'll feel a little more comfortable and be able to use them and understand them a little better. So the first thing we're going to talk about are just the different kind of forms of articles that you can come across in French. So first we have singular articles, and I'm sure you've heard these before: un, la, le, and de. So we'll start off with singular definite articles, and that is when there is a specific item or when you're just talking about the idea of something. So one example would be if you said, j'ai acheté le gâteau. That just means I bought the cake. So then you're talking about the specific item. But you could also say, j'aime le gâteau, and then you're saying, I like this, or just I like cake. So just kind of talking about cake in general. So that can kind of go both ways with the singular definite. Things get a little clearer with the single indefinite. This is when you are talking about one of something, and it's pretty simple. So that is when you could, in English, you would say a, an, or one. So, like, I have an orange. So, an example in French is if you said, tu as un stylo, and that just means you have a pen. So, again, just pretty basic, single, indefinite, just you have one of something, it's that known amount, and you know exactly what you're talking about, and that one's pretty straightforward. However, there is one exception for the single indefinite, and that is when you are talking about someone's job. So, for a job, instead of putting that article in there, like in English, you would say, he is a singer. And so you would think that in French you'd say il est un chanteur, but you actually just say il est chanteur. So in the occasion that you're talking about someone's profession, you drop the article there and just go straight to the profession. So again, il est chanteur, not il est un chanteur, as you would say if you were trying to kind of directly translate from English. So that's the only thing that's complicated about the single indefinite. Finally, we have the single partitive tense, and that is when the amount is unknown, and that's the same as saying some in English. So if you said, oh, I just had some water, that's the same as saying like, elle boit de l'eau, which is she drank some water. And so your articles for the single partitive are de, du, and de la. And then an important thing to note with those articles is that notice how you had de la, but you don't have de le. You would say du in that sense, and that's just a weird rule that there is in French. Instead of saying de le, you would just say du. And so again, for that one, it was just elle boit de l'eau, and that means she drank some water. So single partitive, it means some, you don't know the amount. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the single articles. And then moving on to plural, the plural definite form is les, just les. And again, for that one, you can be speaking about either general or specific. So an example I have for this one is j'aime les films. And by saying that, you could either be saying that you like movies or you like a specific set of movies that someone has just presented to you. And then for the indefinite plural form, you have des, which is des, and that also means some. Pretty similar rules to the single partitive for this one. And you would just say something like je veux des carottes, which means I want some carrots. So those ones are pretty straightforward. It can be a little hard to memorize, but those are just the basic rules of the different articles and articles you can have. So next we'll get into some of the different endings and how those interact and kind of determine your articles and how they can even change sometimes, depending on if it's masculine, feminine, plural. So when you're looking at singular words, specifically nouns, it kind of depends how the word ends to know what article you'll use with it, mainly referring to masculine or feminine. So that could be talking about un, le, or la. And there's some ways to help with that. There isn't really, one way. It's like, okay, if it ends in this letter, it's always going to be masculine or always going to be feminine. But for me, I've noticed that most of the time when it's feminine, it ends in E. And so when it's feminine, you would use la or un as your article. And a few examples for that are la chaussette, which means the sock. You could also say une chaussette, and you'd be saying a sock, or one sock. Un can mean either of those. And then la terre is the earth. That is one of those words that's just always going to be feminine. And then la tomate is the tomato. And so we don't really have something like this in English with animals. So if you have a cat, you would just say, I have a cat, or there's the cat. You don't, because with the, you can't change the gender of the article. But in French, if you were talking about a pet, you would change the article based on their gender. So if you have a female or male cat, for male, you would say j'ai un chat. And if you had a female cat, you'd say j'ai un chat. So it does change with animals and living things in French, but that is something that we don't really come across much in English. And so again, I kind of have noticed a pattern that a lot of the time those feminine nouns end in E, but that is not always the case. And now we're going to get into the masculine endings. So usually those don't end in an E, but there are some exceptions, like le café, which means the coffee. Some other examples of just standard masculine nouns are le jus, which is juice, J-U-S, and then le chocolat, which I'm sure you could guess means the chocolate. Plural gets a little complicated with the endings. You typically would just add S to the end. So say you're saying la pomme, which is an apple, and then you're trying to make that plural and say the apples, you would say les pommes. So that's the easiest way, and you're lucky when you run into that form because it gets a lot more complicated when your word ends in S, Z, or X. And so you have to remember that when it ends in S, Z, or X, you typically do not change the ending at all to make it plural. So an example for that is if you were saying like il est heureux, that means he is happy. If you're trying to say they are happy, you'd say ils sont heureux, and it's the same spelling for both, H-E-U-R-E-U-X. So kind of a weird rule there. If you remember it, it's honestly pretty easy since you don't have to do anything to change it to plural, but you just have to kind of keep that in mind as you move along. And then another weird thing for plural endings is that when you have a word ending in the letters AL, the plural form ends in AUX instead of AL. So one example for that is your singular form is le journal, that's a journal, and then your plural form is les journaux, and so that's the journals. So a few different rules for plural. There's a few more complicated ones that I don't really want to get into today because there are more important things to cover. So yeah, those are how the endings kind of vary depending on your word and article. And now I'll just do a little bit of article review. So we had le, la, and les, and those are all variations of the English word the, and those are used with your definite forms. So when you are talking about either something general or specific. And then un and une are used when you're referring to one of something. So it's a known amount, singular, it's the equivalent to a or an or one. And then you have de la, and de, which is the partitive, and it's translates to some in English, and that's when you do not know the amount of something. And again, the weird rule with that one is that you never say de le, even though you say de la. Instead of de le, you have do. So that is all I have for today. I know that was a lot, so I'm going to post a worksheet as well to help get you familiar with the different endings and articles, and hopefully you can get a better sense of when is the right time to use which. And yeah, see you all next class. Au revoir. Bonjour et bienvenue à leçon 5. Hello and welcome to lesson 5. Today we will be learning about counting and numbers in French and some of the different things that those are helpful for, like phone numbers, dates, prices, and times. So first we will just learn how to count from 1 to 100. Pretty basic, but also very important. If you're trying to pay someone, asking for a price, giving a phone number, trying to say the date or the time. So very important thing to learn, even though it's like sometimes seems very elementary, it's necessary. So first we'll be counting from 1 to 100. We'll of course start with 0 to 10. So 0 is zéro, 1 is un, 2 is deux, 3 is trois, 4 is quatre, 5 is cinq, 6 is six, 7 is sept, 8 is huit, 9 is neuf, and 10 is dix. I'll go over those one more time, and this time try to say it with me if you want to. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Hopefully you have those down. I don't expect you to memorize them right away, but those ones are pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Next, we'll go from 11 to 20 because those teen numbers are get a little complicated. So we left off at 10, which was 10. 11 is 11, 12 is 12, 13 is 13, 14 is 14, 15 is 15, 16 is 16, 17 is 17, 18 18, 19 19, and 20 is 20. So notice a lot of those were like 17, 18, 19. 10 was our 10. And so for 18, for example, that's 10 and 8. So 10 plus 8, that's 18. So that's where those numbers came from. Now let's go ahead and go from 0 to 20. Just practice all those numbers we learned. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I won't go through each number for the next ones going up to 100. I'll just go up by the tens because they, for the most part, follow a pretty similar pattern. So as I said, 20 is 20, 30 is 30, 40 is 40, 50 is 50, 60 is 60, and then now it gets a little more complicated. So 70 is 70, so kind of the same pattern as it was with those teen numbers, 70, so 60 and 10. So if you just think about it that way, 60 plus 10 is 70. And then 80 is 80. So if you think about it, that's 4 and 20. So 4 times 20 is 80. And then 90 is a really weird one, 90. So think 4 times 20 plus 10. That could be a little bit of a complicated math equation to do all the time, but that's 90, 90. And then 100 is 100. And then when you're counting from those numbers 21 to 69, the pattern they follow is, so you have your number you get to, so you have 20, and then the first one will be 21, so you say un, and then once you get to the next one, so 22, notice you drop the a, so instead of saying 20 and 2, it's just 22. It's another just kind of weird random rule for French. For the one, you say a, but the other numbers you do not. So, example, I'm trying to say 34. I would say 34, not 34. So, another one of those weird things to keep in mind when you're counting. And then again, I'm sure as you could expect, it gets a little more complicated once you reach 70, that's 70. So, similar to 20, you just have 70 as your 0. But then once you get to what you may want to say as 70 et un, you'll actually say 71. So 60 plus 11, because that'll get you to 71. And so following that same pattern, 72, 73, 74, 75. And you'll continue following that same pattern until you reach 80, which was your 80. And so then once you get back to 80, it's 81, 82, 83, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, and then your 90, and then you go back to the pattern we used for 70, or our 70. So instead of saying 90 et un, you would say 91. So that 91 is 91, and then 92, 92, And then just skipping a little bit ahead, 99 would be 99. And then finally, 100, we've made it there. 100 is 100. So I know it got really complicated in there, but we just made it all the way to 100. So give yourself a little pat on the back. You can pause it here and count all the way to 100 if you would like to. I don't think that it's worth the time of this video to do that, but it would be really helpful to go ahead and practice that. But now I'm going to move into some applications of the counting we just learned. So the first thing that counting is really important for is knowing dates. And to be able to say dates, we also need to know months. So I'm just going to introduce the months real quick. So January is janvier, February is février, March is mars, April is avril, May is May, but with an I instead of a Y, June is juin, July is juillet, August is août, September is septembre, October is octobre, November is novembre, and December is décembre. So again, just going through the months: janvier, février, mars, avril, mai, juin, juillet, août, septembre, octobre, novembre, décembre. And I'll write those down below too, so you can see how to spell them. And then another thing you need to know for the date is centuries. So for that, an important fact is that 1000 is mille. So this year is 2022. So to say 2022, you would say 2000, which is 2022, which was 22. So 2022 is 2022. If you're trying to say something from before this century, you would, so for example, maybe 1941, that would be 1941. So that one's a little more complicated because before you have 2000, you were at 1900. So just keep that in mind, but most of the dates you'll be writing are probably going to be more recent. So this year specifically is probably the most important one for you to know. So remember 2022. And then another important thing to know when talking about dates in French is that you write them differently than you do here in America. So here in America, you would say, oh, July 4th is the date. Like when you're writing something down, like July 4th, 2022, or 7/4/2022. In France, you would write that 4th of July, 2022, or 4/7/2022. So it's switched. And so it's the same thing when you are saying those in French. Another example I have is the 3rd of January, 2022, which if you're writing that on a piece of paper, you would probably write January 3rd, 2022. So in French, that would, the proper way to say that or write that would be le 3 janvier 2022. So again, that is January 3rd, 2022. And just remember that those are in a different order than English. And if you're in France, that's an important thing to keep in mind when writing down any dates, because that can get really easily mixed up if you have something like January 2nd or February 1st. It can get mixed up pretty easily which one you're trying to discuss there. So those are dates. Another important thing that counting helps us with is telling the time, which is obviously an important thing to be able to do. So in France, when saying the time, you usually say it in terms of 24 hours, not 12. So in that sense, instead of saying it's 1 p.m., it is 13. It is not 1, it's 13. So another important thing, when you're saying the time in French, you would think you would say, like C''est, because that means it is, but the proper way to tell the time is by saying il est. So if you're trying to say it's 1 a.m., you'd say il est 1 heure. And then if you're trying to say it is 1 p.m., you would say il est 13 heures, because 13 was 13, as we just learned earlier in this lesson. So a few more important things about time in French are that there are little slang terms, kind of like we have in English. So say 15 after, or quarter till, quarter after, quarter till, things like that, midnight, noon. So if you were trying to say that it is 5:15, you would say il est 5 heures et quart, so that a quart means and a quarter. And then similarly, if you're trying to say it's 5:45, you'd say 6 heures moins le quart. So important to notice, you say the next hour to come minus that quarter of an hour. And also note that you have le when you're doing the 15 till, and you do not have that same article when you're saying 15 after. So 5:15 was 5 heures et quart, and 5:45 was 6 heures moins le quart. And then you have, say you're trying to say it's 5:30, you'd say 5 heures et demie. So that et demi is and a half. And then also we have noon and midnight. So noon, which would be 12 p.m., is midi. So you would say il est midi. And then if it is midnight, and also if it's noon, you could say il est midi, or you could say il est 12 heures, which was 12, as we talked about earlier. And then if it's midnight, you would say il est minuit, or you would say il est 0 heure, and not many people say that, so try to remember that midnight is minuit and noon is midi. And that is all I have for today in terms of content. So I think we should just go over the counting 1 through 10 one more time, because those are the most important. Actually, I think we should do 1 through 30, because we do need to get to 24 for the time, and for dates 31. So I guess we'll go to 31 and start at 0. So say it with me as I count if you feel that you're ready to. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. So there you have it, counted all the way to 31. And we did learn all the way to 100 and also 1000, which was meal. And again, I will be posting a worksheet for this class. And if you're forgetting anything from the previous lessons, feel free to go back and rewatch those videos. And I'm looking forward to our next lesson, and I'll see you guys next time. Au revoir. Bonjour et bienvenue à la leçon 6. Today we are going to learn about the two most popular and important verbs in French, être and avoir. So with these two verbs, we will learn how to use them, how to conjugate them, what they mean, and just kind of what they are used for. So we've already learned the most basic forms of conjugation. So remember, for the different ER verbs, IR verbs, and RE verbs, but both of these verbs are actually irregular, so neither of them follow one of those conjugation patterns that we have already learned in previous lessons. So as I said, it is most important to know these two verbs if you're going to know only two, especially once we get into the passé composé, which is the past tense, and you'll use these verbs in every passé composé phrase once we get into the past tense. So These verbs are just as important for present tense though, so really try to pay attention to this video because I would say it's one of the most important lessons that we will learn. So first we will talk about être, and this is spelled E-T-R-E, and we have the accent circonflexe over the first E, so that's one of the accents we learned in one of the previous classes. It looks kind of like that. And as I said, it goes over the first E, and that's why it's être, not like être or something. So être translates directly to be, and that's its most common translation, and that is when it is used to express feelings or that someone is late or something similar to that. So an example of a phrase like that would be je suis contente, and that means I am happy. And I'm just kind of going over the different uses of être before we get into the conjugation. So notice in that one, I said je suis, and suis is actually the conjugated form of être for that sentence. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of insight into how bizarre this verb is with its conjugation pattern. So the next example we'll get into for être is when it means to be someone. So in the context of profession specifically. So we talked about professions briefly in another video, but the conjugated form of être is used to explain someone's profession, but when you do this, you drop the article on the profession. So, for example, you say il est médecin. That's how you say he is a doctor. So instead of saying like il est un médecin, which is how you would think you'd say he is a doctor, you drop the article. And again, it's just one of those weird rules of French. There isn't really necessarily a reason to that. That's just kind of how it is. So for that a, the il est, that was the conjugated form of être, and again we'll get into that in a little bit. And then the other most common usage of être, at least for the present tense, is when you're saying to be somewhere. So when you're saying that, you use être with a preposition. So an example of that would be je suis à Paris, which is I am in Paris. So the suis was the conjugated form of être, and then à is your preposition, so that's how you're saying that you are in Paris. So now that we've gone over the uses of être a little bit, we'll go into the conjugation, and I'll review these a few times because, like I said, they are irregular, so there isn't really an easy way to memorize these, no little tricks or anything. So you just kind of have to practice, and before you know it, you'll have it down because you will be using être and also avoir so much. So first, the je form of être is je suis, and that's S-U-I-S. And then for tu, it's tu-es, and that's es. And then for il, elle, and on, it's a, so it's pronounced the same as for tu, but it's spelled est. And then I don't think we've talked about on too much. It kind of just means one. So people use this term a lot when they're making more general statements. So instead of saying he or she, you would say one to just kind of make it apply to more people than a specific person. And then the next form is we, so that's nous sommes. So you can kind of see there it goes from suis to a to some, no pattern whatsoever. And some is spelled S-O-M-M-E-S. So just try to remember there it's some, not som, even though it's an O, so it can be a little misleading. And then the next form is vous, and for vous it is vous êtes. And on the et, you do have that same accent circonflexe on the first E, just to give it that same pronunciation with être. And then finally we have il, elle, sont, so S-O-N-T for that one. And again, for il and elle, that's the plural version of a group of people, so saying like they, and then it is spelled ILS or ELLES, but again, you don't pronounce that S on the end unless your conjugated verb begins with a vowel. So now we'll go over those conjugations again a little faster and less in depth. So first we had je suis, and then tu es, il, elle, on est, nous sommes, vous êtes, and ils, elles sont. So those are our conjugations for être, and then I am going to go ahead and teach you guys the negative version. This is something we'll get into more in a later lesson, but I think it's time to introduce you to negation. So for être, for negation, you add the phrase ne, which is spelled N-E, in front of your conjugated verb, and then the phrase pas, P-A-S, after your conjugated verb. So, for example, je ne suis pas triste. That means I am not sad. So, suis was your conjugated form of être, and like I said, the ne went just before it and the pas just after. So the ne does go in between your subject, such as je or tu, and your conjugated verb. So again, that example was je ne suis pas triste, which was I am not sad. And then another example of a negative with être is il n'est pas à l'école. So this one was the version we talked about with to be somewhere. So we had the être avec, with a preposition, and a was our preposition. So we're saying he is not at school. And also keep in mind with this example, we said il n'est pas. So notice the ne and the a were connected. And that is because our conjugated form of the verb began with a vowel. So we use an N apostrophe instead of ne and then a. So just to kind of simplify that, you do N apostrophe EST. So that's all we're going to talk about for être. Now we will move on to avoir. So avoir is used in several phrases in French that we would expect to use être, because in English we would say to be in that sentence. So the most common examples of that are to be a certain age. So for example, you would say j'ai 12 ans, and that's how you'd say I am 12 years old, but it actually directly translates to I have 12 years. So that's probably the most common or obvious example of that. And then another one is to be hungry or thirsty. So you would say j'ai faim to say I'm hungry, but it translates to I have hunger, which is a little funny. And then it's also used for to be hot or cold. So for example, you would say j'ai froid, and that means I'm cold, but directly translates to I have cold. And then also to be scared, you would say j'ai peur, but it translates to I have fear. So kind of some more weird little things going on there that are a little hard to keep track of and remember, but again, with practice, it'll get easier, and hopefully you'll get it down pretty easily and smoothly. So similarly to être, avoir has a completely irregular conjugation that you just kind of have to memorize. Again, there isn't really a trick to doing so, just practice and determination. So avoir means to have most commonly. That's the most basic translation of it. And it directly translates to have or possess in statements like I have a car or we have a house. So for something like I have a car, you would say j'ai une voiture. And so this is kind of the same format as we did for être, going through the different usages first, and then we'll get into the conjugation. So for that example I just gave, the a was the conjugated form, and so similarly to how we did with the negation of être, it's J apostrophe AI instead of JE space AI, because when one of the words ends with a vowel and the next one begins with one, you just combine the two by doing the J apostrophe or N apostrophe and then your beginning of the next word. And so I also mentioned we have a house, and you would say that by saying nous avons une maison. So avant was the conjugated form of avoir for that statement. So another use of avoir is when it means to be experiencing or suffering from. So to say something like I have a headache, you would say j'ai mal à la tête. And so again, the AI was our conjugated form of avoir. And then also to say he has a fever, you would say il a une fièvre. So a is our conjugated version for that phrase. So now, as I said, we'll go over the different conjugations. So first, for the je form, it's j'ai. So AI is just your conjugated verb, and then the subject is je, but again, like I mentioned, since it's with the AI, you drop the E and replace it with an apostrophe. So next we have tu as, which is spelled A-S, and then il, elle, on a, which is just an A, so without the S. And then for we, it's nous avons, so A-V-O-N-S. And then vous avez, A-V-E-Z. And then ils, elles, ont, so O-N-T for that one. So those are the different conjugations for avoir, and I'll go over them again before we move on to negation for avoir. So again, we had j'ai, tu as, il, elle, on a, nous avons, vous avez, and ils, elles, ont. So as we did for the negative version of être, we will kind of do the same thing for avoir. So for the negative version of avoir, it's the same thing. You put the ne in front of your conjugated form of the verb, but after the subject, and then the pas after the conjugated form of the verb. So for example, je n'ai pas de crayon. So that's how you say I do not have a pencil. And so similarly to être, you did the N apostrophe because your conjugated form begins with a vowel. And then notice for avoir, when you use the negative version, instead of saying en, you would say de, so the pas de crayon. And that's just kind of a rule for avoir. If you were saying I have a crayon, you'd say j'ai un crayon. But if you don't, you put de. So de only goes with the negative version. And so another example for negation with avoir is il n'a pas de chaussures, and that's how you say he does not have shoes. So again, the A was the conjugated form of avoir, and it was the N apostrophe since it starts with a vowel. And then again, notice the pas de chaussures and not pas like une chaussure or les chaussures. So again, chaussure means shoes. So that is the negation for avoir, and that is everything we're going to cover today. I will be posting a worksheet along with this video so that you guys can practice the different conjugations and usages of these verbs. And I hope this class was useful for all of you. À bientôt!